Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to today's webinar, 3 Smart Strategies for Maximizing the Cloud with DevOps. My name is Sarah. I'm from Stratus 10's marketing team. And as everyone is getting settled in, just a few housekeeping items. I've gone ahead and placed everyone in listen-only mode, but we do have time set aside at the end of today's webinar for Q&A. So I encourage you all to submit your questions to the presenters throughout the broadcast. You can do that using the webinar control panel. We will be recording today's session, and we'll go ahead and send you a link and a copy of the slides via email tomorrow so that you can share it with your colleagues or refer back to. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. First is Igor Mamyshin, co-founder and CTO of Agile Stacks. Agile Stacks is a cloud management startup that provides automation for cloud infrastructure and machine learning. Igor has been helping ship software for nearly 20 years, founding and being part of the management team of several startups, as well as working at Sun Microsystems, Oracle, and Accenture. Our other presenters today are Kevin Rizon-Chu and Oscar Moncada from Stratus 10 Cloud Computing Services. Stratus 10 is an Amazon Web Services advanced consulting partner that helps to migrate to the cloud or to implement best practices if companies are already on AWS. Kevin is the co-founder and CTO of Stratus 10. He's a seasoned technical leader with more than 20 years of experience working with startups, SMBs, large enterprises, and government entities. And Oscar is the co-founder and CEO of Stratus 10. His background is in artificial intelligence and software engineering. He's led engineering teams at startups and Fortune 1000 companies. And Oscar is a member of the entrepreneurial program at Harvard University. Finally, before we get started, here is our agenda for today. We'll first be covering agility, then we'll move on to scale, finally cost savings, and then that Q&A from our presenters. Again, please do submit your questions throughout today's session using the webinar control panel. Another warm welcome to everyone today, and I will turn it over to Igor to kick us off. Igor?
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. And we kick it off with agility because in our view, agility is likely the biggest benefit of using the cloud. Agility originated about 20 years ago in software development teams. And since then, it became broadly adopted as a business strategy. Agility is essentially ability for companies to adapt quickly to all forms of change in order to deliver maximum value and deliver best customer experience possible. It's about iterating in quick software releases. And so what we see oftentimes is that companies move to the cloud in order to achieve cost savings. And they discover that the biggest benefit of using the cloud is actually agility. So with this, let's move to the next slide and talk about DevOps and what does DevOps first mean. Agility and DevOps are very, in fact, closely related together. And what we mean by saying DevOps first is the concept of not only using the cloud, but doing it the right way. The cloud was actually designed for agility, and it was designed for DevOps. So teams need to organize around the use of DevOps in the cloud. DevOps is generally defined as an automation-driven model for collaboration between Dev and Ops. Essentially, not just Dev and Ops, but in the entire IT organization, including development, quality assurance, operations, and security, and also increasing collaboration with parts of the business that represent the business. So DevOps is both a set of tools and it is a methodology. And in order to implement DevOps, it requires training and it requires a culture reset. We are still in the process of implementing DevOps in many companies. If you look at Agile, Agile took 20 years for most companies to adopt and execute well. And DevOps is a newer concept, so we expect that we have not seen full benefits of DevOps yet. But many companies recognize the benefit of DevOps, and according to a survey from SUSE, it reveals that 86% of leaders see DevOps as part of their future IT strategy, and 77% plan to incorporate DevOps methodology into their application development and delivery. And let's move to the next slide, please. This is a slide that shows a concept of DevOps portal, which is often the way how companies implement DevOps at scale. DevOps portal enables developer self-service. It allows users to implement continuous deployment and essentially achieve agility, ability to iterate quickly and move your applications between different environments from development to production. And you have an automated CI/CD pipeline in order to move your code from dev to test and into prod. So let's go to the next slide and examine in more detail what are the DevOps best practices. In order to implement, and then I'll turn it over to Oscar, to talk about it.
Thanks, Igor, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. These are some of the DevOps best practices that we recommend in order to take advantage of the cloud. Managing your infrastructure as code, which allows you to keep track of changes in your infrastructure and provides the ability to quickly duplicate that infrastructure as needed. Also, automating configuration management, which allows you to maintain the state of your system even when unexpected changes happen. Managing infrastructure and applications, secrets such as passwords and keys, and encrypting them is a better alternative to embedding them in your code. This allows you to rotate your passwords without actually having to change your infrastructure or application code, and that increases security. Using serverless computing, such as Lambda functions on AWS, allows you to free your developers to focus on writing code and not managing infrastructure. Simple application tasks that run sporadically can potentially be moved to a serverless environment in order to save cost and not have to worry about managing that infrastructure. And continuous integration and continuous delivery involves the end-to-end automation from source to production. This allows you to get continuous feedback on code changes at scale. You can achieve significant improvements by following best practices. One of the companies that we've worked with in the past used to take several months to onboard a client, partly because they had to provision infrastructure for each client due to security requirements. And the deployment process was somewhat manual. After implementing infrastructure as code and a CI/CD pipeline, their onboarding timeline went down to a few days. So there's a significant improvement. Back to you, Igor.
Okay, great. So let's dig into details of what are the CI/CD pipelines and DevOps tool chains. The concept around this is that there is no lack of tools there to automate DevOps, but these tools need to be programmed in order to work together and form a tool chain. Here you see a diagram that shows an example CI/CD pipeline implemented by one of our customers with the help of AgileStack's DevOps automation platform. And they integrated all the steps of their software delivery process, where they use a set of tools to go from build to packaging to deployment, testing, deployment into a staging environment, and then to promoting this into the production environment. And the idea there is that you want to shift left. You want to implement as many steps in your pipeline during the initial development process as possible, including automating compliance and security. And if you build those things into your DevOps pipeline, then you wouldn't have issues achieving compliance and security when you need to move into production. And typical tools for CI/CD, building CI/CD pipelines, they include Jenkins, GitLab, Spinnaker, or AWS code pipeline, which is AWS managed service. So we would recommend any of these tools as a good choice in order to build your CI/CD pipeline. And now let's wrap up our discussion about agility. And the top takeaways here are that in order to achieve agility, you need to eliminate manual provisioning of networks and EC2 instances, enable agility through DevOps automation, and provide developers with proper tools and sufficient flexibility. You need to look into implementing DevSecOps, where you combat security threats at the source and build them into your development process. And organizations are turning into this DevSecOps approach in order to move from a patch-based approach to protection to integrating security into all aspects of development, essentially helping your company to become more secure. Our next topic is about scale.
All right, thank you, Igor. This is Kevin Reisenchu. Let's go next slide. So cloud provisioning and scaling your company in the cloud is very different from your traditional data center provisioning. Back then, you usually would have to order your servers, wait for them to be built and arrive. Then you have to do any customization, memory, disk drives, etc. Then you have to bracket and stack it, power them up before you would even be able to begin configuring and deploying your workload. So that long procurement cycle is gone now with the cloud, and you don't have to provision for your peak days. And what do I mean by that? Let's go to the next slide. So in the past, you would always have to provision for your absolute highest demand of traffic. So let's take a look at the upper left-hand slide. This is a view of your visitors or demand for your site on a typical week. Looking over at the upper right, the problem that you see here is when you're provisioning only for your running average, you're going to end up having days where you're not fully or where you don't have enough capacity to handle the demand that you actually need. Looking at the bottom left image, here you've provisioned for your peak capacity, but now you're just wasting instances or wasting capacity because nobody's using them and they're not being fully utilized. Lastly, in the lower right, here's an example of what auto-scaling would look like within AWS, where you're provisioning just enough for the capacity or provisioning just enough capacity for your demand and then scaling back down when that demand drops and is no longer needed. Next slide. So if you guys have worked with within scaling in the cloud, auto-scaling isn't the only approach. And this image may look a bit complex, but I want you to all think about it as just starting off simple and small and then iterate as you go along. Okay, the key here with the cloud, and they touched about this earlier in the agility, is to build it, to measure it, and then to learn from it, and then continue to iterate. As your company gains traction and grows, look for the bottlenecks within your product, and then fix those. Refactor for the easy wins, and where you can, shift your loads around to AWS managed services. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. So what do I mean by that? Well, instead of running, say, your SQL server on an EC2 instance, move those things over to RDS and let AWS take care of the database administration, the replication and stuff. You just focus on your schemas and moving your data around. Another example is moving your static contents into S3. S3 is designed to quickly serve static files and objects out, and then it doesn't burden your EC2 instances so that they can do other processing. Adding CloudFront will get your contents closer to your customers. And as you begin to utilize these managed services, you may actually find that the amount of human resources that are needed to manage the EC2 instances that you used to run them before will actually drop, and that you'll be able to shift that resource to doing other things and innovate on your product. Where you can, use as much automation as possible, as previously mentioned. And as you do iterate, consider breaking up any piece of your application or the entire application itself from a monolithic application into a bunch of micro services. You probably have heard of the term service-oriented architecture. That's basically what you're doing. Separate your services so that they're in their own tiers, and then this way it allows you to then scale them independently of each other. If you find the bottleneck is in one, you can scale that without having to scale the entire application. And that will actually increase your performance while keeping your costs down. So we went through a app modernization review recently and decoupled one of our clients' legacy applications. Not only were they able to reduce the complexity of the application, but they were able to innovate and add additional features to their application much more quickly. And their engineers were able to focus only on that feature that they were working on and didn't have to worry about breaking another component within the application because they were all decoupled. They were also able to save quite a bit of money as part of our app modernization review. So one of the things to consider if you're not in the cloud yet is that lift and shift migrations will get you into the cloud, and that's good, but it won't give you the benefits and the cost savings until you modernize your application. Another way to modernize your application is to use containers, which is really starting to pick up a lot of traction. It's a good way to run your microservices. In fact, containers, once the realm only for startups, is now being adopted by large established enterprises who know that if they don't innovate and keep up, the startups are going to basically take over. So at this time, I'd like to hand it back over to Igor, who will do a quick dive into containers.
Yeah, containers and microservices are really taking over the software industry, and there is a reason for it. Gartner came out with a prediction saying that by 2022, more than 75% of global organizations will be running containerized applications in production, which is a significant increase from less than 30% today. And why organizations want to use containers? Because they make it easy to implement microservices with different languages and with different tasks and focus on a particular part of your application. It also helps to package your application code, including all the dependencies that it needs to run, and ship it from development into test into production reliably. On this slide, you see various benefits of containers and microservices, as those are closely related together. And with that, I will turn it back to Kevin. Oh, this is actually my slide. This is about another scaling approach that we have implemented with one of our customers, AI-driven advertising network. And in this diagram, you see the approach that we took to implement auto-scaling, to implement various services, and to also achieve huge cost benefits. With this approach, we were able to run on spot instances in AWS and save 75% from the original bill that originally they were using just VMs and regular on-demand instances. So what you see here is that we created the entire infrastructure using a stack template that describes infrastructure services managed and deployed as a unit. And we implemented infrastructure as code definition for all of these various AWS services. On the left, you see AWS managed services such as Elasticsearch and SageMaker and Elastic Cache. And then on the right, you see services that are running inside of a Kubernetes cluster, and they run on Spot instances, and they are used to run various microservices. This team implemented 40 different microservices that were responsible for different aspects of their system. And as you see, the Kubernetes cluster is running all of these microservices, and for high availability, the cluster is spread across 3 availability zones: West, 2A, 2B, and 2C, in order to reduce the impact of zone failures. Worker nodes are running on Spot instances, and they are also auto-scaled in order to scale up and down based on load. And so when there is a time when nobody is running advertisement, like at night, the system automatically scales down to just 3 nodes. And early in the morning, when business picks up, it scales up to as many as 60 nodes in order to provide very large scale for this customer. So with this, I will turn it over back to Kevin.
Thank you. So the key takeaways within scaling are there are just a multitude of different options that you can deploy in order to scale through use of containers, writing microservices, breaking up your applications, and using various AWS managed services. More services are coming out almost every day. So you got to stay informed and stay up to date. How do you do that? Subscribe to the AWS blog, do the What's New feed that they have. Both are great ways of staying up to date with any new releases or even feature releases within existing products. Where possible, using these managed services over running your own on EC2 will help you scale. Don't bother reinventing the wheel. These services that AWS manages are designed to scale not just for your workloads, but across their entire customer footprint. So they're doing this much more at scale than any one company can do. And lastly, the architectural path that you're going to choose will affect your costs. So do keep that in mind, for good or for bad. So speaking of costs, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Oscar, who's going to discuss cost-saving strategies when working in the cloud.
Thanks, Kevin. So as we heard, companies move to the cloud mostly for cost savings. However, if not managed properly, costs can actually be higher. We've seen many cases where companies who are not aware of how to properly size instances or how to manage costs end up spending a lot more than what they anticipated. One of the worst offenders we've found was a company we worked with in the past who had budgeted around $3 million a year to spend on AWS, and about 10 months later, they were spending almost $1 million per month. So this was significant, and the reason was due to the fact that every development team got unrestricted access to accounts. So developers would provision infrastructure and for testing purposes and then forget to decommission it. So multiply that times a dozen or so different teams and you have a pretty big bill. So not only should you think about having AWS policies to restrict the types and sizes of resources that people can provision or work with, but you should also consider having an internal policy to determine who can create and who can manage these accounts and how these accounts are managed. So once you have those policies in place, it makes it easier to control your costs, or at least keep it from growing in a crazy way. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit about lift and shift or common approaches to cloud migration. 2 common approaches are lift and shift and re-architecture. On the lift and shift, the idea is that you can take your infrastructure applications as they currently are deployed in your data center or on-prem and move them directly into the cloud and hope that everything just works. Most of the times that is the case, but sometimes there is no one-to-one mapping, so there's a little bit of re-architecture that's needed. Depending on the application that you have and how things are currently configured on your data center, you may or may not be able to easily lift and shift your applications to the cloud. Not to mention, lifting and shifting doesn't really take advantage of everything that the cloud offers, and your cost savings will be minimal, if any. Re-architecting, on the other hand, is a more involved process, and it takes a little more time and resources to get your application to be scalable and decoupled. However, putting the effort to do this may be very well worth it if it means that you'll be able to take advantage of all the features that the cloud has to offer. Not to mention that a well-architected infrastructure is an efficient infrastructure, which means it'll perform well and it'll be cost-effective, which is one of the main ideas of moving to the cloud. One of the things you can do to determine which migration approach is best for you is to do a true cost of ownership analysis, which can help you understand your infrastructure cost, how your current infrastructure will map into AWS, and give you a pretty good idea of how cost-effective your application will be. So that would be the first thing you should do when you're trying to migrate the cloud. Next slide, please. Oh. Thanks. So regardless of how you migrate your application to the cloud, you have to understand that there's a little bit of a migration bubble. And what that means is a period of time during the migration where costs will actually increase for several reasons. You have to take into account the initial planning assessment. You have to take into account that you may be running multiple environments during the migration, one on-prem and one on the cloud while you do your testing. You may have to pay for additional migration consulting fees if you don't have the resources in-house. Any third-party tools that you may use for migration will increase the cost, and you may have lease penalties for shutting down your services data center. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive at first. You might be thinking, why, shouldn't the cloud be cheaper? And the answer is yes. But going through the process of properly migrating your applications and workloads will eventually make your costs a lot more efficient. It'll eventually cost you less after you get past this migration bubble. And now I'll turn it back to Igor, who's going to share a couple more cost optimization strategies.
Thank you, Oscar. And here we would like to mention several best practices, several strategies to optimize cost in the cloud. And so initially when companies move to the cloud from on-prem environments, they typically continue to use a lot of VMs using regular on-demand instances. And it's okay as a starting point, and as a next step, it makes sense to find those applications that experience rapid change or that have large-scale requirements, right? And transition those applications to use containers and spot instances. And just that approach alone will help you to achieve close to 60% savings on running your compute. Now, if the application is not experiencing that big of a load, probably it makes sense to not even do much of the migration, just leave it run in a VM. But we saw many times that by taking applications that have high load requirements and transitioning them to containers and spot instances, companies can achieve significant cost savings. Another strategy is to use serverless lambdas. That's just also a very highly scalable approach, and also comes with huge cost savings. We see companies using both serverless and containers at the same time, depending on the use case. For storage, S3 object storage helps you to store massive amounts of data, which is reliable and also very extremely low cost. We also recommend considering to move data in some cases from relational database to non-relational database, such as DynamoDB. Again, it helps to run it at lower cost. And finally, autoscaling. that can be used with a lot of services, including managed services. It could be used with VMs, and it could be used with containers. And that also can bring as much as 75% in cost savings. So combined, all these strategies, they often allow companies to reduce cost by as much as 90%, comparing to not optimized, not auto-scaled infrastructure that is running in the cloud. So this could make a huge difference. And now over to Oscar.
Thanks, Igor. So for some takeaways for cost savings, keep in mind that lift and shift that migration approach can end up being a little more expensive. And so if you decide to do a lift and shift migration approach, start thinking about what you're going to do after. So after your application is up and running on AWS with the same type of servers that is running at the data center, how will you start taking advantage of AWS? So start thinking about how you will re-architect your infrastructure so that you don't end up with the same infrastructure for months, and you're basically paying for the same type of services. Number two is always try to do a true cost analysis, which can be very useful to get a good idea of how your current servers or how your current VMs map into VMs or EC2 instances on AWS and what other services you can use. Right, so this will give you a really good idea of your cost on AWS, so it's highly recommended to do that. Then keep in mind that there's this migration bubble, right, where initially during the migration process, the cost will increase because you have to pay for these additional resources, consultation fees, etc. But eventually the cost savings will be significant. And then lastly, make sure that you utilize, once you're on AWS, make sure you utilize all the tools that they offer, right? Use additional cost optimization strategies such as reserve instances, spot instances that we've been mentioning in the past. Now auto-scaling groups have the ability to have mixed instance types, which allows you to use spot instances and on demand, and that definitely makes a difference. Also moving the serverless when possible, when available, right? So I think that completes our presentation for today. I think there are some questions from the audience. Back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks everybody for the presentation. And yes, for those of you on the line today, we are welcoming your questions. Go ahead and find that Q&A module in the webinar control panel and submit your questions through there. I want to start off with a first question. This one looks like it's going to be for Igor. Igor, question is as follows. One of the tenets of DevOps is the ability to automate a lot of the manual stuff engineers used to have to do. Sometimes internal processes get in the way. What is your recommendation to navigate those challenges? Igor?
Yeah, that's a good question. DevOps is, as we discussed, is about collaboration between teams, right? And that includes collaboration on how we implement these internal processes. So we don't have to automate absolutely everything in using the DevOps automation approaches. So if a company has a policy that changes need to be manually tested in stage environment before they are deployed into production, well, that's an approach that a lot of companies do take. And that's perfectly fine with the DevOps automation approaches. Many pipelines, they include this step of manual review for security purposes or manual review for a stakeholder approving deployment into production. And that's that's the way how many teams, in fact, do operate. Very
good. Thanks, Igor. Okay, next question. And again, we welcoming your questions through the webinar control panel and the Q&A module. Next question, this one's going to be for Oscar from Stratus 10. Oscar, what types of things should we keep in mind when managing costs on AWS? What types of things should we keep in mind when managing cost on AWS?
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, there's a few things that you need to keep in mind, such as data. I think data is one of the biggest culprits of high costs, right? data going into AWS is free, but data coming out is not. So if you have large amounts of data that you have to constantly or frequently access, then you might want to keep that in mind, right? It's good for storing large amounts of data, but getting large amounts of data out constantly can be expensive. Also, make sure that you're not over-provisioning resources. You should monitor the usage on a monthly basis and see, do we have a server that is too large? It's only being utilized 5% or at 5% or something. So keeping that in mind always helps. Also, we talked about moving certain workloads like batch processing to Lambda functions. Sometimes people do that, but they don't realize that those Lambda functions end up constantly running. So if those Lambda functions are running too frequently, then it might be cheaper to consider pushing them back to EC2 instances, right? There's a cost balance there. If your Lambda function runs once a day, then that's great. If it only runs for a few seconds once a day, that's great. You don't need to have a server that's running 24/7 just to kind of host that functionality. But if it's running every 2 minutes and it's starting to cost you a lot more, then it might make sense to push it back to an EC2 instance, whether it's a spot instance or you buy a reservation for it. And that's another thing to keep in mind.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Oscar. Next one. This is kind of a fun one. This one's for, I'm going to send it to Igor. Igor, what is your favorite service in AWS and how have you learned to get the most out of it?
That's a great question. How do I know? There are 400 services out there. I like them all. But seriously, I think that my favorite service is still S3. It's one of the first services that AWS released, object storage, S3, right? And it still continues to amaze me how scalable and how reliable this service is, and also how cheap it is. Now we work with several companies that do machine learning, and it's especially actually great for storing massive amounts of data on AWS, working with gigabytes and terabytes of data, and it's fast, it's scalable, it's very reliable, and I frankly don't see similar services in either other cloud providers, and especially on-prem. When we implement some systems in data centers, S3 often is this service that I miss the most still, that we cannot find that highly scalable and very inexpensive object storage. So that's my favorite one.
Thanks, Igor. All right, next up, this is going to be for Kevin. Kevin from Stratus 10. Kevin, how can I determine the right instance size for my application? How can I determine the right instance size for my application? Kevin?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think Oscar had touched on it earlier as well for this, but you really have to look at the workload that you're running on EC2 instances. You look at CPU, look at memory, network I/O, make sure you're measuring those. Earlier during the scaling, we mentioned build, measure, and learn. But basically, by measuring your workloads, you're able to deduce if your instances are right-sized or not. And then you make adjustments accordingly. Also, one other thing to really keep in mind is that new instance classes are released pretty consistently, about a year or so. And those newer instances will usually give you much better performance at a similar or even lower price point than the previous generations. So you're getting more bang for spending the same amount of money, if not less. So keep those in mind as you're determining your right size and your application.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Okay, next one is back to Igor. Igor, is infrastructure automation just about optimizing the tool chain, or is there more to it in terms of value to my IT team and business teams?
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, DevOps toolchain, right? So DevOps toolchain is about linking all the tools. There's no lack of tools there, right? They need to be part of the process. Build automation, continuous integration, continuous deployment, infrastructure as code, right? So those are all the tools that enable actually collaboration between teams. So it's about helping teams, development and operations and security to work together and to split responsibilities and to implement best practices as code, so that these practices can be easily shared and scaled across the organization. They can be reviewed and they can be improved over time. And so that's what I think the goal should be when we talk about DevOps toolchain and how it relates to increasing your efficiency of a team in the DevOps process. Another thing comes to mind is that it's a good way to actually split responsibilities between developers, security, infrastructure, operations, database, because if you have infrastructure as code approach, helps each team to own one part of that development process and apply their best knowledge to that and share it with the rest of the team. That's what makes infrastructure as code so powerful too. Great
insight. Thanks, Igor. Okay, last question before we wrap up for today. This question I think is going to be for Kevin. Kevin from Stratus 10, what options does AWS provide to scale my database? What options does AWS provide to scale my database? Kevin?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So there's two ways you can look at it. If you're talking about a relational database, more than likely you're going to be using RDS. Traditional way, scaling vertically, just putting your RDS on a larger instance size. Keep in mind, though, that that will require downtime. Otherwise, you can start scaling horizontally, basically by adding read replicas and directing your read queries to those read replicas, and then only using your master or your write master for those writes. Another thing you can try is using Aurora Serverless. If you have a very unpredictable workload pattern, Serverless is a good option for scaling up and down when you have the unpredictable workloads. And then lastly, sharding your data. So if you have multiple tables, consider breaking them out into multiple RDS instances. That'll spread your IOs, spread your CPUs, and allow you to continue to grow and scale much more efficiently. If you're talking about the NoSQL database side of things, consider using DynamoDB, which has a bunch of different options around provisioning, auto-scaling, or even the new on-demand that lets you scale quite rapidly. Just keep in mind, though, that if you do that, demands are unpredictable, and so will your bill be. So just keep in mind, what your comfort level is and what you're trying to achieve when you're scaling.
Great. Very good. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the presentation for today, so we'll have to leave it there. For those of you that have outstanding questions, we'll be sure to follow up through email to get those answered. If you're ready to learn more about bringing Agile Stack's platform to your organization, please email igor@agilestacks.com or visit agilestacks.com. If you're on the hunt for expertise on migrating and managing your infrastructure on AWS, please email Stratus10 at hello@stratus10.com or visit Stratus10's website. On behalf of everyone here at Stratus 10 and Agile Stacks, thanks to everyone for attending and enjoy your day.